Hello, I'm your host, Dr. Braha. Welcome to the Zermed Show. On the show, we will feature local community physicians who are experts in their respective fields and who will share their experiences and wisdom with us. We cover a broad range of health topics on the show, and we welcome today Dr. Ramy Abdel-Naby, Trauma Medical Director and Chief of the Trauma Surgery and Surgical ICU Division at One Brooklyn Health at Brookdale Hospital here in Brooklyn. It's a serious title there, Doc. Trauma is a very, very stressful field. It's a very rewarding field, and we're really excited to have you here today. I think you're maybe the first trauma surgeon we've had on here, and what you do. First of all, thank you for what you do for our community and for Brooklyn. Before we get started, I think our viewers would really enjoy knowing that you are a Brooklyn boy.
Yes.
Born and raised. Tell us a little bit about yourself before we delve into the world of trauma surgery.
Absolutely, yes. Thank you for having me, and I'm very honored to be here. I, like you said, Brooklyn born and raised, grew up in Bensonhurst, went to public school all my life, went to Brooklyn College for undergrad, and then I graduated to go to Downstate Medical School, where I also completed my residency training. And then afterwards, I went to Texas. I ventured out to San Antonio, where I did my fellowship training for 1 year at UT San Antonio, and then found my way back to Brooklyn, which I consider home, and I can't escape.
How does it feel to have been, sort of raised by this borough, and now to be here as a major player in the medical field in Brooklyn as the chief of trauma at a major trauma center?
Honestly, sometimes it feels like a dream for me, because I truly do care about Brooklyn, its home, and I never thought that I would be in the position that I am to really give back to the communities that I grew up in and the communities that I've educated me. And there's just so much diversity and culture that I really embrace that I couldn't find anywhere else. And that's why it's home. And so I'm truly honored, and I feel very privileged to be here.
Yeah, and we are privileged to have you serving our community in the trauma center. For our viewers today, let's go into a little bit of the background here. What is a trauma service? What is a trauma center? What is a trauma surgeon? If you could, give us a little basic explanation for me and your viewers as to what it is a trauma service means.
So the basic understanding of a trauma surgeon is a physician, a surgeon who specializes in treating the injured patient. And injuries come in various different forms. Typically, people in Brooklyn think of injuries as gunshot or stabbed victims. However, patients who get involved in motor vehicle collisions or fall down the stairs, those are all also trauma patients, and they suffer multiple different injuries. And so as a trauma surgeon, it's our job to assess those injuries and then determine what is the appropriate care for them. As far as a trauma center, essentially it is a hospital in which there's a group of trauma specialists. And it doesn't have to just be trauma surgeons. Trauma specialists include emergency room physicians and nurses, surgical ICU physicians and nurses. And really, it's a multidisciplinary approach in treating the injured patient. And we all come together to assess the patient and to determine what is the best treatment for them.
Right, so it's not just having a surgeon who knows how to operate on someone who's been in a car accident or suffered a gunshot wound, but it's all that support team that makes the hospital a trauma center. And so not every hospital is a trauma center in Brooklyn, correct?
That is correct, yeah. So to be a trauma center in Brooklyn, in New York City, and really in many places around the country, the Department of Health designates a hospital a trauma center. And the way they do that is they go by whether the hospital has first been verified by the American College of Surgeons. And that verification process is actually very rigorous. What happens is a group of expert trauma surgeons from around the country will evaluate and visit the hospital to make sure that we're all adhering to the same standards of trauma care, and we're abiding by the latest evidence-based medicine to make sure that really if anybody's injured, it doesn't really matter which hospital you go to around the country. And that's really why the American College of Surgeons has taken such a special interest in making sure that all trauma centers across the country, if they are verified, they adhere to these practices.
Right, so the trauma team and the trauma specialists at your hospital are inspected, or they're shown, they have to show that they're able and capable to provide all these services for all various different types of injuries. We talked a bit, or you mentioned a bit, that injuries can vary widely. How about age? Do they vary among age? Do you take care of all comers? What are some of the data there with age and
Absolutely.
treating adults of all different ages?
So we definitely do treat patients of all different ages. When you look at Brookdale, geographically where we're located, we are truly a safety net hospital. There's not that many hospitals around us, and so we are ready at all times to take care of trauma patients from as young as infants to as old as they come. And what we found is that our population is actually aging. People are living longer thanks to the advancements of medicine and primary care. And so we are seeing more and more elderly patients into their 80s, 90s, even hundreds that are falling down and getting injured and having femur fractures or hip fractures. Brookdale actually has a very interesting reputation of seeing trauma patients that, or rather the misconception is that the majority of trauma patients that come into Brookdale are patients who suffer from gunshot violence or stabbing violence. And that's actually a very common misconception. When you look at our data, only 22% of our injured patients are victims of gun violence and stabbing violence. The number one leading cause of trauma that we see is secondary to blunt mechanism, and out of those patients, the number one reason patients are injured is elderly patients falling down. And then the second most common cause are patients who come in suffering from injuries related to motor vehicle mechanisms. So for example, car versus car, or car versus cyclist, or car versus pedestrian. So when you start realizing that blunt trauma patients are actually the majority of what we see, and interestingly, they're actually the more complex patients that we treat. There's often a lot more chaos when you have a patient, a young person who is shot, but when you have a patient who is involved in a really bad car crash, for example, they have injury patterns that are much more complex, and that requires much more critical thinking and a higher level of decision making. And when you look back, those patients take a lot more resources for saving their lives and treating them, and then eventually getting them out of the hospital.
Right. I recall my days as an EMT and EMS that someone who went through the windshield of a car was a lot harder to take care of than a gunshot wound.
Absolutely.
The gunshot wound, if there was only one, you know where it went, you know where your trouble might be. Someone being run over by a car or going through a windshield, that blunt force on the body affects almost every organ. Any organ can bleed or be damaged.
That is correct, yeah. And it provides a very challenging, diagnostically it's very challenging for us, because not only do we have to identify all these injuries that affect multiple systems throughout the body, but then we also have to prioritize which one needs to be treated first. And sometimes the treatment for one might affect the treatment for another system. So, academically and mentally, it can be very taxing for the trauma team to evaluate and treat patients of blunt trauma.
And these are decisions you're making very quickly in the trauma bay, which is the room where the trauma patient first comes to, and you have to make these decisions rather quickly,
Absolutely,
correct?
yes. The care of the trauma patient, it's not just about making quick decisions, but it's also managing a very large team, and then also trying to console and inform the family of the patients that are understandably worried about their loved ones. And so you see that the trauma surgeon and the trauma team really have a lot on their plate to do in a very short amount of time.
Right. You know, I recall being in the trauma centers and in the trauma bay, and you know, many times, yeah, the misconception is that it's young people, gunshot violence, assaults, things like that. But it's interesting to hear how much of an elderly population you're seeing as our population ages. Falls are a pretty big deal. In the ER where I work, I see lots of patients coming in who were, you know, just in the kitchen making cookies, and next thing you know, they have a major trauma. Tell us a little bit about falls, or and maybe for our elderly population who's watching today, you know, what are some of the ways they can prevent, you know, seeing you or one of your team members in the trauma center
Absolutely.
as they age?
So, you know, elderly patients bring an added or an additional mix of issues to the table. Oftentimes they have comorbid conditions, whether it's hypertension or diabetes or heart conditions. In addition, they're taking multiple different medications that some of them actually may be contributing to their fall and their injuries. And then finally, quite a few of them will be on blood thinners for their comorbid conditions. And all of these complicate the evaluation and treatment of the trauma patient.
A lot harder than a healthy 18-year-old who fell off their bike.
Exactly. And so for us, we actually have a strong injury prevention and community outreach team within our division. And their job is to identify what are most common reasons for injured patients that come into our hospital, and then figure out how we can reach out to the community to bring down the risk and reduce the risk of injury. And so, for example, sometimes we'll go out to nursing homes and educate patients, their family and staff, on how to make sure that they assess a patient for fall risk and how to prevent them from falling from either the bed or the wheelchair or going to the shower. You know, we go out to senior homes and do the same thing to really stress that it's all about prevention, and the way you prevent that is by paying attention to very common things, making sure you're not wearing something that might cause you to slip, making sure you have a bench in the bathroom, things of that nature. And then if they do get injured, the other thing is it's not usually the only time or the last time they get injured. So we do a lot of education also for patients and their families while they're in the hospital to make sure that when they are discharged, if they are going back home, that they have the appropriate resources to try to prevent that injury from happening again.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of prevention can be had to prevent them from coming to see you. It's interesting when you're a physician trying not to see patients. You're in the, not only do you take care of patients at their worst moments, but you also spend a lot of time trying to prevent them from even needing you in the future. So we talked a bit about elderly trauma. Let's talk about some of the factors, and maybe this applies to a younger population, but probably to you know, across the spectrum of ages. What about substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, you know, the toxins that some people decide to put in their bodies, and the role that that plays not only in hurting them medically, but you know, becoming a trauma patient, unfortunately, you know, having to end up at Brookdale one night under your care.
You know, substance abuse also provides an incredible challenge for, you know, trauma centers, because not only do we see the epidemic of fentanyl use and substance misuse in the communities, but you know, when a patient comes and they're injured and they have certain substances on board, it makes it harder for us to evaluate their mental status. It makes it harder for us to determine whether they truly have a significant traumatic brain injury or not, and how much of that substance plays into their presentation. Our trauma center data shows that 16% of injured patients that come through our doors have alcohol misuse, and about 13% have other substance abuse disorders. And so the American College of Surgeons, again, going back to the verification, one of the standards that we really that we're expected to abide by is that we have to screen all trauma patients that come in for alcohol misuse and substance misuse. And if a patient does screen positive, then it is also our job to make sure that they receive the appropriate resources for their rehabilitation, both inside the hospital and after discharge. And so we are able to refer them to various different programs for them to get the help that they need for their addiction.
Right. You know, when patients are on certain substances, as simple as alcohol, tend not to make the greatest decisions in the world and
Correct.
end up in a trauma center. We talked a bit about blunt trauma, which is sort of a car accident or falling down, penetrating trauma, gunshot wounds and stabbings. So you're here in Brooklyn. You grew up here in Brooklyn, but you know, before the show, we talked about your time in Texas.
Yes.
And that's where you went to get some further training. Where, you know, how is it different out in San Antonio and, you know, taking care of patients in Texas, where there's a lot more of highways and forests and farms, as opposed to more urban setting like Brooklyn?
It was very interesting. You know, I really treasured and valued my education experience out in Texas, and it opened up my eyes to a different world of trauma patients and injury patterns. Like you mentioned, in Texas, highways, vehicles are traveling at much higher speeds, and there are certain laws, for example, like motorcyclists don't have to wear helmets, as an example. And so what you end up seeing, or what I end up seeing in Texas, are very similar trauma patients, but a higher degree of severity and a higher degree of injury. Whereas in New York City, thankfully, we do have laws and we do have a lot of different things that kind of lower the force and the impact on blunt trauma patients. Things like helmet use that helps reduce TBI incidents. Things like speed cameras, it does slow down vehicles so that you're not getting patients who are being struck by vehicles or are involved in car crashes that were going 90, 100 miles an hour.
You know, it's interesting. You mentioned two things that I think we all as Brooklyn residents see quite a bit of: helmets and speeding, or, you know, the lack of helmets. What's your experience? And I'm sure you've seen this before, but maybe tell our viewers so we can help educate. You know, we see people riding around on these motorized scooters, whether it's electric scooters, the four-wheel drive, and they're going fast, without helmets, without seatbelts, without protection. You know, maybe you could shed some light, given your history of working out in Texas, where you see a lot of these accidents at high speed without helmets, how significant those two risk factors are, speed and lack of protection.
They are incredibly, not just significant, but they are life-altering.
It's the end of the game flying off of one of these scooters
Exactly.
at 50, 60, 70 miles an hour.
Exactly, and people don't necessarily think or have the perception that this can happen to me. Oftentimes they feel like they're in control of the vehicle, that they may be aware of their surroundings, that they might not need the extra protection of either a helmet or slowing down. But once that impact happens, especially if you end up sustaining a traumatic brain injury, I mean, that is not just life-altering for the patient, but also for their families. And I think we in Brooklyn are experiencing the same phenomena that is being seen not just across all of New York City, but really across the country, where as the popularity of e-scooters and really e-mobility is increasing, because yes, although it might be greener for the environment, we're also seeing the same kind of issues where people don't feel the danger or as much of a danger that they would if they were, let's say, riding a motorcycle.
Or in a car, like 30 miles an hour in a car where you have some steel around you.
Exactly. And
or
so
aluminum is different than an e-scooter.
Exactly. And so naturally people bring their guard down. They think this is a fun, recreational way to get around the city. But the truth is that it can just be as devastating as, any other injury that you might sustain.
Right. And without a helmet on, I've seen it, and obviously you've seen it way more than I have. Once there's that huge impact on a sidewalk or on a street or into a car, an unprotected head, it's not a pretty picture in the emergency room.
No, it's not.
Cutting holes in the skull, removing the skull. Educate us on this.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have actually seen patients die from these injuries, and they might not, die right away on the scene or shortly after coming to the hospital, but eventually the traumatic brain injury, there's only so much that the neurosurgeons on the trauma team can do to alleviate the pressure that is caused by the swelling of the brain or the bleeding that happens around the brain. And so once it gets to a certain point, unfortunately, patients do go down the path of potential brain death. And it's so devastating, not just to see a young patient go through that, but also their family members see and witness that as well.
Yeah, it's not worth the scooter ride without a helmet, or the
Absolutely not.
you know the four-wheel drive, the ATVs. Some of these are not even meant to be on the street; they're meant to be on a dirt road where you still have to have a helmet, but you might be a bit safer. Yeah, and that brings a good point here of dealing with patients and their families in these traumatic moments. I'm sure your job is incredibly rewarding. I am sure that more times it's stressful and it's hard on you, hard on your mental health and physical health as well. You know, all these hours running into an operating room. You know, what puts you into trauma as opposed to any other field of surgery? This is probably one of the hardest jobs in medicine, being a traumatologist.
I have to say, I think, and I don't mean to sound cheesy when I say this, but I do think that trauma is kind of like in my genetics and my DNA. When I was in Brooklyn College, I volunteered to be a part of the Brooklyn College volunteer EMS squad. And I continued to do that for many years, and then eventually I actually ended up getting a job as a 911 EMT as well for New York City.
So you were answering 911 calls.
Yeah, and so to me, it's just something about helping patients or helping people and their families in really the scariest time of their lives and in the most neediest time of their lives, and making sure that not only am I treating an injury, but also trying to be a reassuring face in a time of chaos and fear. And I felt like becoming a trauma surgeon was the natural progression to continue providing that next level of care. So to me, it was just a natural graduation into doing trauma surgery.
Yeah, you're there with our population, with our patients, at almost their worst moments ever in life.
Yeah.
And that happens rather quickly. They're at a party 1 minute, and unfortunately gunshots ring out, and everyone has gone from having a great time to near death, you know, whoever was injured. And that brings me over to time. We have a little bit of time left. Let's talk about time for our viewers today, about how important time is when it comes to the traumatology, to trauma specialty. We used to hear a lot about the golden hour. Is it still the golden hour? And if someone's watching today and, you know, an injury might happen, explain how important time is in getting to you.
Absolutely. You know, time is of the essence. Time to hemorrhage control, time to treating TBI patients, time to getting a patient to the hospital can make all of the difference. You know, going back to what your question about the difference between Texas and here, one of the very lucky things that many of our patients have in Brooklyn is that almost no matter where you get injured, you're almost about like anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes to a hospital, and probably
or even to a trauma center, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas,
we're lucky.
For example, in San Antonio, that time sometimes was a 45-minute helicopter ride.
And that plays a role.
Yeah, and that plays a huge role. And so time is definitely of the essence, and thankfully we do see patients who are injured really before they start going down a physiological stress that's sometimes hard to bring them back from. And I'm grateful that I'm in a city that affords us, because of all the resources that we have and kind of like the infrastructure that we have, to bring those patients to the trauma center rather quickly.
Yeah, you know, our community, especially the community around Brookdale, I mean, what would it be like without a trauma center there? They'd have to start traveling to other parts of Brooklyn, and this, as you said, plays a role.
Absolutely. You know, again, Brookdale has been a cornerstone of the neighborhoods of Central and East Brooklyn for decades. And for as long as Brookdale has been around, the hospital has been treating injured patients. We've been a state-designated trauma center since 1982. We've been a ACS-verified trauma center since 2016. And so we continue to provide that level of care. When you look at where we're situated geographically and then superimpose the socioeconomic status of our patient population, you quickly understand the magnitude and the significance of our title as a safety net hospital. Our patients oftentimes have nowhere else to go but Brookdale. And so what the team at Brookdale, and it's a large team, what we really try to do is make sure that we're providing that high level standard of care to those patients at all times. And it's important to also mention that it's not just about the trauma surgeons. It's really not just about the ED team as well. Oftentimes they are the face of trauma centers. However, it really takes the entire hospital, from the building services individuals and security and respiratory therapists and physical therapists and nutritionists, nurses from all different staff, from all different floors. When you start realizing how many people need to come together and be on the same page to get one individual patient out of the hospital, you realize it's a great feat.
I think that you are 100% correct in telling our viewers of how many people it takes to get a patient, and especially a trauma patient, successfully out of the hospital. Yeah. It's not like the TV shows, the old ER show, where patients show up and there's a few-minute clip where they're all running around and then at the end of the show, they show them having some hot chocolate. Yeah. It's not like that.
Not that at all.
And we are honored to have you, Dr. Abdel-Naby, MD, Trauma Medical Director, Department of Surgery, Chief Trauma Surgery and Surgical ICU at Brookdale Hospital Medical Center, One Brooklyn Health. God bless you and all you do for our community, for our city.
Thank you.
You're truly a New York hero. I want to thank you for watching and thank you for your interest in our show and your desire to become involved and educated in healthcare. I invite you to visit our website, www.zermed.com, and check out our tools, connect with us on social media. You can also call us at 718-510-2103. Stay healthy, Brooklyn. Be well. Goodbye.